You just put your lips together and you come real close. Can you blow my whistle, baby, here we go.
Speaking Human is the book that was published last November, The Tragedy of the Retarded Genius. And people say that line is offensive. It's supposed to be offensive because that's what Jamil, being myself, was called most of his life. And so it's important for some people to get a glimpse into how tragic that can actually be for a child growing up actually believing that when they don't have an official diagnosis of autism. Speaking Human. I'm actually doing an audio version of this book for free on YouTube, as you can see, as we're doing. I have already done 4 episodes that you can find on YouTube, which is called Speaking Human Director's Cut. I am now doing a summary of the whole book as we speak, and then I will continue doing the series ongoing of Speaking Human, episode 5 all the way through to 40, roughly. So because of his Asperger's, Jamil has less of a sense of boundaries, of proprietary, so he asks Rennie somewhat probing questions about her personal life. So that's something already that someone with autism is going to do. She opens up to him about her estranged father and her frightening mother, who has violent tendencies and connections to scary people. Eventually, Rennie's luck runs out and she finds herself imprisoned in her own house. This is a true story. Now, Rennie is Adrienne Ferguson, who is the author of the book, and Jamil is myself, but it's actually me as the ghostwriter for Rennie. It's an interesting way that the book was written. Concerned Sabrina, Auntie Sabrina, actually works with Jamil and Micah is Jamil's brother, in order to rescue her. Jamil appears at her window in the night and drives her away to safety. So that's another thing, that people with autism don't have a sense of risk, and so they just do things without feeling any fear. As they drive, Jamil decides to tell Rennie about his childhood and the long saga that forged him into the man he has become. And that's where the story starts. It now goes back to talking about Jamil's life. And basically, this is my life, which most people find almost unbelievable. But here he is talking to you guys. Jamil started his schooling, his late junior school, high school, at Northeast Boys Private College. Now, these are made-up names. He is obsessed with accurately keeping track of time and other precise facts and details. So already you can tell this guy has autistic tendencies. He's heckled relentlessly by his peers. So Jamil is heckled relentlessly. He's heckled by his peers as well as several of his teachers, and frequently punished for things that seem perfectly normal to him. So he begins to suspect that there may be something wrong with him. As a baby, he was mute for about 2 years, until he spontaneously began speaking in complete sentences in 2 languages. His parents were both Lebanese immigrants and devout Christians, would do their best to accommodate him, but they could not protect him from the outside world. Now, at this time in the 80s, autism wasn't something that was quite widely known, so it wasn't something that people could comprehend. They just thought Gabriel was, I don't know, a bit strange or something like that. All right. Now, Jamil longs growing up for connection to other people, but he dislikes physical contact. He struggles to interpret nuances of meaning and emotion in words and facial expressions, and people call him an idiot often enough that he wonders if they are correct. So that's what was happening to my younger self growing up. So he has an impressive knack for music, and in fact became a child prodigy in piano and could play back long strings of notes just by listening. And this happened from the age of 1.5 to 2 to 3, roughly. He begins piano lessons and was never able to read music, and then is able to learn complex classical pieces by ear. Jamil then goes to the conservatory or the Conservatorium of Music and actually gets a perfect score in classical piano, Boss Briggs, at the age of 10, only by listening. So he can't actually read, but he has something called a savant memory, but no one knows this yet. He doesn't know this, no one else knows this. They just think he might be good at piano. When he is 8, Jamil is introduced to Sabrina. So we've gone back in time, and we now know Jamil meets Sabrina, who's 12 years old at this time, and he falls in love with her. Now, she just finds him annoying. He's an annoying little brat who thinks he knows everything. The reason I bring up these characteristics is that if you see these characteristics in other people around you, you might think, holy crap, maybe they have autism, or maybe they did, but were never diagnosed. He also suffers from Tourette's. Yes, I actually suffer from Tourette's, and probably most people here don't even know about that. I'm able to regulate it with medication and a lot of exercise, and that's one of the reasons I exercise quite a fair bit. I still have random outbursts, but I try to find a place where most people aren't around to let it happen when it happens. These things make him deeply self-conscious. So he's at school and he's going blah, blah, and he doesn't know what Tourette's is, and he thinks he must really be a disgusting human being that he feels compelled to do this thing that gets him in trouble. He gets beaten up at the age of 10 by a 16-year-old. And of course, being autistic, this drives him to the opposite extreme, which is learning martial arts. And he also finds that he can relate to computers. And he feels very comfortable with their inherently rigid and predictable rules. Spurred along by further bullying from the vicious Peter, for 2 years, he becomes depressed and writes multiple suicide notes. Jamil develops a fixation on a pretty girl named Jessica on a bus, and he follows her home one day, awkwardly introducing himself when she notices and confronts him. He later goes to a school dance to see Jessica, but the pressure of the noisy crowd and the social interaction causes him, my good friend Chewy Chewbacca, to have an anxiety attack and collapse. Once again, this guy's life is just an abject disaster, right, from the beginning. But he doesn't know these things, so he doesn't know that crowds would trigger him. No one else knows that, so they think he's going for attention, they think he's just being an idiot, they think he's just a young kid. People don't even know. Someone think he's just a loser. Jamil spends much of his time biking around town and practicing martial arts and becoming unusually fit. He finally gets the opportunity to stand up to Peter, and he ends up beating him quite soundly. But the consequence of that is an emerging beast that rages within him, because Jamil, aka Gabriel, doesn't like violence and doesn't like to fight and doesn't like to be in conflict. And so what happens is that all of that rage actually turns into another entity that grows inside him. And that beast frightens him more and more as it resurfaces, causing him to excessively many years later pummel a younger bully. And he is frightened when it resurfaces again, causing him to repeatedly bash this bully unnecessarily. Jamil gets the chance to confront Eddie one day in the future, but upon seeing how small and non-threatening Eddie has become, because by this time Eddie is now 20-something and Jamil is now 6 foot. I'm now my size. By the time I was 15, I was my height, and I had been training for a long time, so I was like that high in this guy. So his lingering grudge dissipates and becomes hatred towards himself. After stopping for a time, Jamil begins playing the piano again. This is a summary, and all of this is going to be done in a series ongoing. Jamil begins playing the piano again, accompanying his charismatic father Sam. Father Sam is one of the only people that recognizes. He also suffers from Tourette's. Yes, I actually suffer from Tourette's, and probably most people here don't even know about that. I'm able to regulate it with medication and a lot of exercise, and that's one of the reasons I exercise quite a fair bit, which is learning martial arts. Once again, this guy's life is just an abject disaster, right, from the beginning. But he doesn't know these things, so he doesn't know that crowds would trigger him. No one else knows that, so they think he's going for attention, they think he's just being an idiot, they think he's just a young kid. People don't even know. Someone think he's just a loser unnecessarily. Father Sam is one of the only people that recognizes Jamil as being a special person who has a lot of talents. Jamil earns many compliments but doesn't realize it, of course, with his autism, that he's actually alienating the other musician, David, until David confronts him. And of course, the beast that is now matured within Jamil inside the church has to be held back by Father Sam. And we will talk about that in the book too. Yes, Jamil got violent in a church in front of the parishioners, and the priest, Father Sam, was holding Jamil back. Jamil also decides at a later point to ride his bicycle down the steps of the opera house, but he doesn't realize that this is something that's not actually a correct thing to do. He wanted to test how the circular wheels would mash against the combination of gravity and a step movement. At the end of high school, he gets a date to the senior prom, but he ends up getting drunk and collapsing after getting dumped by the girl that he took to the prom. He'd never drank before, leading to a messy and unpleasant experience. Back in the present, Jamil pauses this story, and Rennie reflects upon what she has learned. She has acquired a newfound respect for her companion and everything that has endured, which has helped to put her own troubles in a bit of perspective. She learns that her mother has sent goons to beat up Jamil and Micah, but they remain dedicated to helping her nonetheless. And that's because Jamil actually drops her off out of state, drives all the way back, and then the next day, he and his brother, being myself and my brother, were attacked. My brother's eye socket got broken. And then my brother said, "Get the number plate, the license plate." So I actually grabbed the license plate off the car and ripped it off. And the police asked me if I got the license plate, and I said, "Here it is." Because, of course, having autism, you take things literally. So I literally grabbed the license plate. They got arrested. So it's interesting, this is what happens. Basically, what Jamil does is he ends up getting her out of state. So he ends up getting her to the police. She ends up testifying against her mother, and she ends up getting into witness protection.
Here we go.
Now, we flash back in time again. We now go back to teenage Jamil. He decides to board a plane to his parents' homeland of the Lebanon. And this is his longing now. After a very long wait at the airport, he's retrieved by Uncle Randy, who happens to be the uncle of Jamil's father. He makes a series of awkward attempts to make various first impressions, which we'll talk about in the ongoing series. But of course, with autism and never being around people, he completely stuffs it up, and no one else knows he has autism, so he completely destroys every relationship he has with every cousin. But there was one interesting thing Jamil could pick up, and that was that he had one cousin, Eugene. Eugene, it turns out, is a psychopath. He's also highly intelligent. No one else can see this except for Jamil. And Jamil doesn't know that he's seeing this. He just is starting to watch human behavior and notices that this one particular person has very odd behavior compared to other neurotypicals. Eugene decides to teach Jamil how to act around humans, except that Jamil decides that he does not care for Eugene's misanthropic and manipulative worldviews. Jamil is summoned back to Australia for a time, during which he unsuccessfully tries to continue his schooling and get a job to earn money. He learns that Father Sam has a brain tumor, but is told that everything will be fine. He goes back to Lebanon, and Uncle Randy leaves Jamil, because no one knows how to deal with Jamil. He leaves him in a cabin in the mountains, in the beautiful white and green mountains full of rivers of the North Lebanese Alps. He said he'll be back in 3 days. He doesn't come back. Jamil runs out of food, so he goes into the basement and finds bread and old onions. And so I, Jamil, start living on bread and onions for 2 weeks. He still doesn't come back. And so Jamil notices that cars go past and he decides to jump in one of them. He ends up traveling over all of Lebanon, hitchhiking, finding food where he can, and has to walk sometimes for up to 6 hours at a time, and discovers social interaction with people, and constantly interacting with people in the car each time, learning basic phrases like, how's your time here? How's your life in Lebanon? Now, there was one guy, I asked him, how was your time? And he goes, and I started laughing. And then 2 minutes later, he goes, it turns out he had some sort of disorder. I didn't realize that at the time. He ends up hitchhiking. After hitchhiking, Jamil decides to actually find Uncle Randy's house on the coast. He ends up finding him, and apparently Jamil was exiled by Uncle Randy, but never got the hint because of the autism. So when he confronted them, he got punched in the face by Uncle Randy. We'll talk more about that in the book. He continues traveling. Now, the next thing is that Jamil continues traveling now because he's lost all hope in humanity, ends up at the Syrian border and climbs over a wall to be because he was curious to see what lies beyond. He is immediately confronted by armed men who accuse me, Jamil, of being a Jewish spy. I have a gun to my head for 45 minutes. I'm very confused.
Here we go.
Later on, I meet some cousins of mine I didn't know were cousins, and they teach Jamil how to speak to women and to dress. And so Jamil learns how to speak to women and becomes very good at it. And unfortunately, the guys actually get very upset because now the women want to talk to Jamil and not to them. So they kidnap him and they dump him in a mountain a little while away. After that, they came to pick a fight with him and he took all of them down. You'll see in the book why this all happens. Now, the next part was that Jamil took a bike and decided to ride to the mountains. He didn't get too far. He tried to ride back, ended up reaching 80 k's an hour or 55 miles an hour and falls off a cliff. And he believed he was dead at the time because when I fell off the cliff, there was nothing that was going to save me. And I had a fear of dying as approaching the cliff, but as I fell off it, I knew that I was dead. But I actually lost all of my fear of death once I fell off that cliff. A group of hooligans in the shopping mall decided to try to steal my brother's chain, gold ring, by asking him the time. And I knew that was what they were trying to do. Anyway, I stopped them, but they jumped us, all six of us. All six of them jumped us, and I decided not to fight back. And so they broke my nose. As you can see, my nose is slightly bent. And they broke my teeth, so these teeth are fake. And then I decided after that, if I wasn't going to do martial arts anymore, Jamil was going to do weights. So Jamil does weights and grows his hair really long. Father Sam dies, and Jamil then leaves his faith at the same time. He becomes an atheist. I already knew by the age of 15 that once my priest died, I would no longer be a Christian because I knew that I didn't really believe in it, even though I kept trying to. But when he died so young, I didn't expect that. So I didn't realize that I would have to lose my faith at 19 as opposed to 40 something. 2 years pass and Jamil has become a very successful DJ. What Jamil does is mix Middle Eastern tracks with hip hop beats and becomes wildly successful throughout Western Sydney, selling thousands of CDs and going all over certain venues, going on radio and DJing in shopping malls. But he does not find it fulfilling. So he returns to Lebanon and spends more time in the mountains. By this time he goes back to Lebanon and he's able to expose Uncle Randy and Eugene's treacherous and divisive behavior. And how is he able to do that? Well, he remembered something that Uncle Randy said in 1999. And when he went back in 2004, he actually remembered what he had said and knew that there was a contradiction in what he had said. All right, so Jamil continues to work. He finds a job selling mortgages, finds no joy in it. But he becomes unbelievably successful at it because he has the mathematics in his head, which he doesn't know that he can do. He ends up ultimately attempting his final attempt of suicide. He slits his wrists and takes overdoses on pills and about to fall into a tub of water so that he could drown. So he basically was trying to kill himself 3 different ways at the same time. Unfortunately, his mother and father find out. His father actually rescues his body that's now in a coma. And Jamil, myself, ends up in a coma for 2.5 days. He then believes when he wakes up, because he was supposed to have brain damage, but he doesn't have brain damage. Instead, he's put on antipsychotic medication, which actually turns him into a genius. So before that, Jamil, being myself, could not tell the difference between the present, past, and future. The antipsychotic somehow allowed his mind to stop the thoughts from going crazy, and he was able to realize that he could do complex mathematical calculations in his head, and became an unbelievably successful mortgage broker. What he discovered, though, was that he discovered that the world was corrupt. He discovered that the organization he was working for was just making money and not helping the people. So he decided to turn against them and set up his own business. Now, he ends up setting up his own business, and whilst doing that, he starts learning Arabic over the internet with someone who teaches him from Syria. So he ends up deciding to go and meet her, and he falls in love with her. This is Jamil, myself, falls in love with this girl in Syria, and ends up learning a lot about Syria, and was also there when ISIS started to appear in 2012. Now, he ends up coming back to Australia, and during this whole 7-year period, he's now learning how to function with human beings, and via cognitive behavioral therapy by someone called Edith. She was a genius woman who was married to an autistic savant who found, and he died. She was married to an autistic savant who developed marketing systems that are now used all over the world. So Edith teaches him how to function with humanity over a period of 7 years. That's where the story ends, because I can't talk about the rest. That is the whole story. That's part 1, volume 1, Speaking Human, the tragedy of the retarded genius. That is a summary of the book. That's it. So we've done 5 episodes on YouTube. If you want, go to YouTube. It is Speaking Human Director's Cut. And I will now do all of the rest of the episodes, and I've just now given you the whole story. If you want the book, you can get it from me, paypal.me/gabsmacked. Give me your postal address, it's $19 US. There is an ebook, yes, there's an ebook for like $1 or $2 from Google. Type in Speaking Human, Tragedy of the Retarded Genius, ebook. It'll come up. There's heaps of different places you can get it as well. The book is more difficult to read because my life was so confusing. You can go to realspeakinghuman.com. You can find it there, or paypal.me/gabsmacked. I'll get you an autographed copy. That's a summary of the book, and we will go through the whole book, episode by episode, on YouTube. And I've got to go to Wednesday Wisdom. So I will love you and leave you until next time.
Can you blow my whistle, baby? Whistle, baby.